Welcome to this Indigenous Day of Prayer service on this Sunday next to the summer solstice, with leadership from myself, Douglas duCharme, the minister at Bloor Street United Church, and Robin Byers from here at St. Matthew's, with a lot of wisdom and guidance from Elder Catherine.
We begin with fire. We send our prayers to the Creator God. We begin in the East. We call upon the ancestors and the peoples of the East. We move to the South. We honor the people and the ancestors of the South. We move to the West. We honor the people and the ancestors of the West. We move to the North. We honor the peoples and the ancestors of the North. Creator God and all good spirits, be with us this morning and this day.
The summer solstice is the day when the sun travels its longest path through the sky. It's a sacred time for Indigenous peoples, and so it's no coincidence that here on Turtle Island we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day at this time. It's an opportunity for learning. It's an opportunity for journeying together toward truth, toward reconciliation. In the presence of Creator we gather. I'm glad that you are here. Not that long ago, it seems, we lit a candle of incarnation into the longest night of winter. And now, on this day, we find grace here as these longest days bring light upon light. The light calls us to free ourselves for connection, for the truth-telling vulnerability of long evening conversations. Here is grace. Here is grace that some Indigenous peoples of this land journey with us, followers of Jesus' way together, after all that's been done and all that now remains to be done for healing to come. So now, in the light of Christ, may we witness what journeying together might now look like as we are invited into new relationship, unshackling ourselves and one another, that we might walk alongside one another into summer's light of this day. We welcome one another and we cherish one another in this community where we are not alone, and so we share peace with one another. May the peace of Christ be with you all. Let's take a moment to share a sign of that peace with one another.
I invite you to close your eyes. Feel your feet firmly upon the floor. Breathe. Breathe more deeply into your belly. You are here now. Root yourself to this place. Feel roots grow from your feet right down through the floor, through the basement, through the foundation, deep into the earth. Breathe. You are on the shore of an ancient lake. On the corner you know as St. Clair West and Rushton Road are ancestor stones. They were left here at the end of the last ice age, reminders of the people who came before us to this place and are still with us. The stones are grandmother and grandfather, still alive. This meeting place on the shore of a great lake has been the site of human life for more than 15,000 years. The Wendat grew corn, squash, beans, and sunflowers here. The Anishinaabe hunted and fished, harvested the abundance of the Carolinian forest. The Seneca built a village at what is now called Bobby Point. Europeans came and treaties were made. We are now on the territory covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. We are all treaty people now. Here, many people of many nations have come, 100,000 or more Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit. Many more come from around the globe to find themselves here. Some of you or your ancestors came willingly, others not so much. Breathe. Feel the land beneath your feet. Feel what were once rivers and streams running down to that great lake, now encased in concrete, but still here. Breathe. Give thanks.
Sometimes when we're wrestling with things in life, we just want the biblical writers to keep things simple. What's it all about in all those words? And on occasion, they actually indulge us. For example, the prophets in the Hebrew Bible were about just two things, in essence: criticizing and energizing. Their words disturbed the status quo, the assumption that the way things are is just the way things are. And they advocated a new way of living that's personal and social and spiritual and economic and political. And so, for example, the prophet Micah, 700 years before Jesus lived, describes a path, not of outward forms, or rituals, but of inner transformation. We read words from the prophet Micah, chapter 6. With what shall I come before the Holy One and bow myself before God on high? Shall I come before God with burnt offerings, with calves a year old? Will the Holy One be pleased with thousands of rams, with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? God has told you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Holy One require of you, but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Centuries later, another voice of transformation, Jesus, was asked by his opponents, so in a nutshell, what's it all about? And Jesus replies in words we read in Matthew 22. When the Pharisees heard that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, they gathered together, and one of them, an expert in the law, asked him a question to test him. Teacher, which commandment in the law is the greatest? And he said to them, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the greatest and first commandment, and the second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang all of the law and all of the prophets. And then just a couple of decades later, a man who was trying to help others learn to follow Jesus' way struggled in a letter to them to sum it up. His own understanding still very new to him, writing to the church in Galatia, if we live by the Spirit, let us also be guided by the Spirit. In these readings, we hear God's voice. God is still speaking. Thanks be to God.
May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable in your sight, Creator God. I want to talk about walking with. We have been exploring the nature of call over these last weeks, singing, "Here I am, God. Is it I, God? I have heard you calling in the night. I will go, God, if you lead me. I will hold your people in the light." If we recall that first and greatest commandment and the second that is like unto it as we sing, we might feel our own light within us and from whom it comes, and know that we can go out into the light of day to love our neighbor as ourselves. A simple practice, love, but not an easy one. Who is our neighbor now in 2024? Who shares our day-to-day lives with the news of the world in the palms of our hands? We bear witness to a global village where all our neighbors, all to be held in a love we hold with all our hearts, all our souls, all our minds, with our whole selves. We bear witness to a global village where all our neighbors, all to be held in the love we hold, gremlins. Is the sound better now? Okay. We bear witness to a global village where all our neighbors, all to be held in the love we hold with all our hearts, all our souls, all our minds, with our whole selves. How close do we come to fulfilling these commandments in the institutional church? In the United Church, closer than some. But do we still give offerings for the sins of our souls? Are we so burdened by the United Church's past denial of Indigenous spirituality and operation of residential schools that we cannot discern how to live in the Spirit now, led by the Spirit into the future? I will start with the past, my past, which may recall your past. Where did the Spirit lead? Right out the door of the institutional church. In the Anglican Church of my childhood and young adulthood, to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans was not something to be spoken of. Even if you were studying for the priesthood, like my friend Nick, or were just coming out, like me. Down in the US, former Florida beauty queen Anita Bryant was leading a crusade against any law that would give me and my friends equal rights. She called herself a Christian. So did her followers. We stopped drinking Florida orange juice. We campaigned to keep her from speaking in Canada. But prohibition of discrimination based on sexual orientation was still not in the Ontario Human Rights Code, not until 1986. Or Alberta's Individual Rights Protection Act, and a mission taken all the way to the Supreme Court in the late 1990s by Delwyn Vriend, one of my great heroes. Who had discriminated against him? A private Christian college. By the time the Vriend case was heard, I had moved to Toronto, married Michael, begun teaching human rights at George Brown College. I had met Catherine. I had met other Indigenous activists and was deeply involved in Indigenous solidarity, conscious of confronting my own whiteness and the institutions, the church, the public schools, the academy, that had taught me white supremacy thinking. I was committed to doing justice, but I can't say that I felt I was walking humbly with God. What I know now was that God was walking with me, nonetheless. The Coalition for a Public Inquiry into Ipperwash that I co-founded and facilitated joined the Aboriginal Rights Coalition. I met a different kind of Christian. I became a blanket exercise facilitator. I learned about and worked with the student Christian movement and Christian peacemaker teams. Most important, I met Gitsatanamuk. In 2001, we still didn't have a public inquiry into how and why the OPP had fired on unarmed Stony Point people during a 1995 occupation of Ipperwash Provincial Park, killed Dudley George and wounded others, and beaten World War II veteran and Kettle Point band counselor Bernard George so badly his heart had to be restarted. And what had been happening out on the water in Escanopiditch, burnt church, between Mi'kmaq lobster fishers, settler fishers, fishery enforcement officers, and the RCMP since 1999 looked like it was shaping up in almost the same way as the mobilization of police and, in fact, army at Ipperwash. I joined a Christian Peacemaker Team's delegation because I wanted to see firsthand what was going on. Gitsatanamuk, a Wampanoag lawyer originally from Maine, had married into the Escanopiditch community and was one of the first to speak with us. He talked about the peace and friendship treaties made between the Wabanaki peoples and the Europeans. He talked about how, when the Wabanaki made treaties, they raised their children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, great-great-grandchildren in the spirit of these agreements, so they would not be forgotten. He talked about how quick the Europeans were to forget, how loath to polish the chain of the treaties, as the children did here today. The trained CPT team members accompanied the lobster fishers out on their boats, cameras ready to record any confrontations with authorities or settlers. Footage shot by the team of a Department of Fisheries and Oceans vessel ramming a small boat, sending 3 fishers into Miramichi Bay, had already gone round the world. We delegates joined other observers on the shore, both CPTers and members of groups like the Atlantic chapter of the Aboriginal Rights Coalition and Alaniso Bonsawin's National Film Board crew, shooting what would become her feature, Is the Crown at War with Us? Observing from shore meant lots of time sitting, looking out to sea, and so for talking. One afternoon, Gitsatanamuk and I sat side by side on the hood of his truck, binoculars ready if needed. There had been a powwow that weekend, 2 sunrise ceremonies. I asked questions. Gitsatanamuk had published a book with Francis Hancock called Ceremony is Life Itself. I wanted to know more about what he called ceremonial time, our lifetimes measured as one continuous ceremony, expressed in terms of thanksgiving. A demonstration of how much the people believe in balance, how we can use our patience, our tolerance, because creation is tolerant with us. I wanted to know more about his vision of how we might live a sacred way, not a money way, a silver way. How the small Escanopiditch managed fishery reflected fundamental principles that all life is sacred, that we are all equal, that nobody controls here, that we work together. Tensions escalated out on the bay as the Department of Fisheries and Oceans confiscated more and more traps from the Escanopiditch fishers, and more than 300 RCMP arrived from all over the Maritimes. The warriors set up barricades and checkpoints at all entrances to the community. RCMP helicopters buzzed overhead. It was a pivotal moment in what activists and academics were beginning to call the Indigenous food sovereignty movement. I joined the CPT team as an intern as most of the delegates returned home. Anglican worker priest Dan Heap. Yeah, stayed on as well. Gitsatanamuk and I kept talking. When I left to teach my classes, we embraced. "Thanks for coming to the people with your heart and ears," he said. But Gitsatanamuk also urged me to take a deeper dive into my own people's spiritual traditions, into my Celtic ancestors and their ways. In Ceremony as Life Itself, he notes that Jesus gave his followers a prayer, not the prayer, as an example of how to pray, how the created can have a relationship with the Creator. And Jesus urges all people to realize their ceremonies from the Creator. Gitsatanamuk believed wholeheartedly in that and still believes wholeheartedly in that. Dan Heap and I flew home together, fast friends. That winter would come an invitation from Christian peacemaker teams to join a month-long Reserve Corps training in Winnipeg in May. The application included many questions about my history, and I had my own questions. Could I join an organization that at that time was restricted to Christians? Was I willing to be a public Christian? I've been part of CPT for almost 25 years now, half-time, full-time, several weeks a year, however I've been able to serve. My focus has been on the Americas, CPT's Turtle Island Support Network and the Columbia team, and on the slow process of co-facilitating the organizational change that ultimately led Christian peacemaker teams becoming community peacemaker teams, open to people of all faiths, all spiritualities. For some years, I represented CPT in the Ottawa-based America's Policy Group, a national organization, retiring following a stint as president just as the Nujimo Awewengitigan National Healing Forest Project began. Where had conversations with Gitsatanamuk and continuing commitment to Indigenous solidarity ultimately led? Back in the church door. But this time, after seeking healing, not only from the hurt of exclusion as a queer person, but also the guilt and shame of my personal and ancestral connection to Christian institutions that had done much harm. Letting go of guilt and shame has allowed me to walk the red road beside Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit companions with integrity, or at least more integrity, grounded in the complex histories of my own northern peoples when welcomed to share in ceremony. In 2016, a delegation to Grassy Narrows First Nation with CPT led to an invitation to a sacred paint ceremony in Winnipeg with the Oji Cree woman who had gifted me a name 15 years earlier, Sharamino. That line of red ochre that you may have noticed across our foreheads in the opening slide It matches Sharon's, and it led here to St. Matt's and to renewed relationships with old friends and collaborators, Catherine Brooks and Dan and Mary Lou Smoke, now elders. We're all about the same age. Now elders and respected traditional teachers and counselors, I am grateful that they have joined me as collaborators here in this sacred place, as all places are sacred. I have learned many things, not least that I will stumble often on this red road that is mine to walk. I know that tobacco should come first to honor the land and plants when I work in the garden, but the old habit of labeling this plant a weed and pulling up roots without taking time to make an offering bedevils me nonetheless. I forget the songs I've been taught. I forget the prayers. Ceremony, as life itself, is hard, just as polishing silver is hard, so much so that few of us polish silver anymore. Coming to right relations is hard. I am profoundly grateful to our elder in residence, Padaban Migazekwe, Dr. Catherine Brooks, daughter of a residential school survivor who shows great courage in her loving work with a group housed in a church and primarily settlers like me. I am honored to be her helper, her Ashkabewis, and to be patiently told and retold the teachings of her elders and knowledge keepers as I learn to listen better and show more humility. The United Church of Canada entered its 100th year with a member of the Heiltsuk First Nation, the Reverend Dr. Carmen Lansdowne, as its 44th moderator. Congregations like ours have just agreed to support an autonomous Indigenous United Church of Canada, recalling the parallel lines of the two-row wampum. When elected as moderator, Reverend Dr. Lansdowne envisioned a church committed to build new connections and rebuild old ones, to work towards social change that sees a world cared for and human dignity honored, to walk together every day in repentance and reconciliation, to march and fight and change unjust systems together, to pray together, to sing together, to discern together. Let us listen to her words for us, this Indigenous Peoples Day of Prayer.
Breathe deep and hold on to this hint of God at work now in this place, as they have always been at work here and in all places. Breathe deep and rest in the blessing of stillness. Breathe deep and let possibility begin to unfurl. Breathe deep and let strength and courage grow within. Go in peace.